They called it a toy, a tin can on wheels. The German generals laughed when they first saw it on the battlefield. But what they didn't know was that this little machine would crawl through mud, dodge bullets, and carry armies to victory. From North Africa to Normandy, the humble Jeep would become the backbone of an entire war. The desert wind howled across the North African dunes, swirling up sand that clung to everything: boots, rifles, faces, and even the small, box-shaped vehicle that rumbled across the horizon. German soldiers squinted through binoculars, laughter echoing through their ranks as they watched the strange contraption bounce over the uneven ground. Ein Spielzeugwagen, one of them muttered, a toy car. Little did they know that so-called toy would become one of the deadliest, most reliable, and beloved machines of the Second World War. It began, not on a battlefield, but in an office, an urgent memo on the desk of the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department in July 1940. The request was simple on paper, but nearly impossible in reality. We need a general-purpose, four-wheel drive reconnaissance vehicle, lightweight, durable, capable of carrying 3 men and a mounted gun. Prototype delivery, 49 days. The United States hadn't even entered the war yet, but the clouds of conflict were darkening over Europe, and Washington knew it had to prepare. The old motorcycles and heavy scout cars were too slow, too clumsy, and too unreliable. The Army needed something new, something small, fast, and tough as nails. Out of 135 manufacturers contacted, only 3 answered the call: American Bantam Car Company, Willis Overland, and Ford Motor Company. Bantam, a struggling small automaker in Butler, Pennsylvania, was the first to take the challenge seriously. They didn't have much, just a skeleton crew, limited funding, and a ticking clock. But they had spirit. Chief Engineer Harold Christ and his team locked themselves in a garage, working 20-hour days. They drew blueprints on cigarette packs, welded frames at midnight, and tested parts until sparks lit the night. When the U.S. Army came for inspection just 49 days later, Bantam rolled out a rough but remarkable little machine. A squat, four-wheel drive vehicle with a tiny 45-horsepower engine and a face like a bulldog. Soldiers who saw it couldn't stop smiling. It looked ridiculous. But when it jumped curbs, climbed hills, and crossed rivers without hesitation, that laughter turned to quiet respect. The Army was impressed, but cautious. Bantam didn't have the production capacity to supply the thousands of vehicles needed for wartime. So they passed the blueprints to Willis and Ford for evaluation and improvement. That decision would change history. Willis engineers took the Bantam's idea and made it meaner. They added their Go Devil engine, a 2.2-liter, 60-horsepower monster that gave the small frame incredible torque. Ford joined in, refining the body design for mass production and simplifying parts to speed up assembly. By late 1941, a new legend had been born. The Willis MB Jeep, later standardized with Ford's GPW model. Its name, Jeep, was said to come from the military term GP, general purpose, or perhaps from the cartoon character Eugene the Jeep, small, loyal, and able to go anywhere. Whatever the truth, the name stuck like mud on its tires. When the first batches rolled out, soldiers didn't know what to make of them. The little Jeeps looked fragile, almost comical. "You're telling me that's supposed to go into combat?" One infantryman laughed. Another joked, "My kid's pedal car looks sturdier." But laughter turned to all the first time they drove it. The Jeep could climb steep hills like a goat, plow through mud like a tractor, and weave through trees faster than any armored car. It could start in freezing cold or blazing desert heat. It could even float across shallow rivers. Soon, the Jeep earned nicknames from every front line: the Blitz Buggy, Peep, Little Moses, and the Iron Pony. Soldiers loved it because it did everything. Carried troops, towed artillery, delivered ammo, hauled stretchers, and even mounted machine guns. One officer wrote home, "The Jeep is like a faithful dog. It follows you anywhere and never complains." By early 1942, the Jeep's real test began, its first major deployment in North Africa. Operation Torch was underway. American forces, under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, were landing in Morocco and Algeria to face the feared Afrika Korps led by Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. The scorching winds of the Sahara turned the battlefield into a furnace. Sand clogged engines, melted tires, and blinded men. Tanks got stuck in soft dunes. But the Jeep? The Jeep didn't care. In the chaos of landing, Jeeps were the first to roll off the transport ships. The sound of their engines broke the silence as they charged up the beach, their small tires leaving sharp tracks across the sand. To the Germans watching through binoculars from a ridge, it was laughable. They saw these tiny vehicles bouncing along, no armor, no heavy weapons, open roofs, and they laughed. "The Americans bring toys to the desert," one officer sneered. But their laughter didn't last long. The Jeeps moved fast, too fast to be easy targets. They darted between dunes like insects, disappearing and reappearing before artillery could aim. They carried communications officers, medics, and recon teams behind enemy lines. They towed 37mm anti-tank guns, ferried ammunition to trapped soldiers, and rescued the wounded under fire. When tanks got bogged down, it was the jeep that came to the rescue, pulling them free with grit and a steel cable. Rommel's troops began to notice something unsettling. These little vehicles seemed to appear out of nowhere, silent one moment, roaring the next. They were too small to hit, too quick to catch, and too tough to stop. A German war diary from 1942 noted, "The Americans have a curious light car. It moves over the sand with alarming speed and is difficult to destroy. They use it for everything." The British, who had received jeeps through the Lend-Lease program, loved them even more. The elite long-range desert group, LRDG, used them for deep desert raids, customizing them with extra fuel tanks, water canisters, and twin-mounted Vickers machine guns. Under the burning sun, their jeeps became sand-colored ghosts that haunted German convoys. In the desert night, the tiny vehicles slipped behind enemy lines to cut communication cables, destroy supply depots, and vanish before dawn. Even General Eisenhower himself called the jeep one of the most vital tools of the war. He ranked it alongside the bazooka, the Dakota transport aircraft, and the atomic bomb as one of the 4 weapons that won World War II. But before glory came, the jeep had to prove itself again and again. Early models broke down under strain, steering rods snapped, and engines overheated. But the soldiers fixed them with whatever they had, wire, tape, or even shoe leather. It became a symbol not only of engineering genius, but also of American adaptability. There were moments in the desert when men depended on their jeep like a lifeline. One soldier recalled being stranded after his truck was destroyed by German fire. "We thought we were done for," he said. But a jeep came crawling over the dunes like some kind of miracle. The driver threw me a canteen and said, "Hop in." I swear that engine sounded like hope itself. The jeep also became a cultural icon among troops. Soldiers decorated them with pin-up art, nicknames, and even small flags. Some tied beer bottles to the bumpers as makeshift rattles. Others mounted radios and played swing music as they drove through the Sahara. A British mechanic once said, "If you gave an American soldier a jeep, a rope, and a wrench, he could build an army out of nothing." By the end of 1942, even the Germans had stopped laughing. They began capturing jeeps and using them for their own patrols. One captured German lieutenant admitted during interrogation, "We thought it was ridiculous until we drove one." The jeep's legend had begun. From its humble birth in a Pennsylvania workshop to its baptism by fire in the African desert, the jeep had already earned its place in history. It wasn't fast, flashy, or armored, but it was unstoppable. It symbolized something deeper, America's ability to innovate, improvise, and endure. As the sun set over the Sahara and the wind buried the tracks of the last convoy, the little vehicles sat by their tents, dust-covered but still gleaming in the orange light. Soldiers leaned against their hoods, smoking cigarettes and staring at the endless dunes. They didn't see just a machine, they saw a friend, a savior, a miracle on wheels. And somewhere in the distance, as Rommel's tanks retreated into the twilight, one officer whispered the truth his men had already learned the hard way. The war had moved north. The golden sands of North Africa were behind them now. Victory had been earned through grit, sweat, and steel. But the little jeep that had conquered the desert wasn't done yet. It was just getting started. From the blazing dunes of Tunisia, the Allies turned their eyes toward Europe, the soft underbelly of Hitler's fortress. Their next stop, Sicily, the gateway to Italy. In the summer of 1943, the Mediterranean shimmered under the heat of war. Operation Husky was underway, the largest amphibious invasion in history up to that point. More than 3,000 ships, thousands of aircraft, and over 500,000 men prepared to storm the beaches of Sicily. And among them, stacked in rows on landing craft, sat hundreds of small, olive-green jeeps, silent, waiting for the engines to roar. They looked almost fragile against the steel hulls of tanks and landing ships, yet every soldier knew. Once the ramp dropped, those little machines would be the first to touch the enemy shore. When the invasion began, chaos followed. Explosions lit up the night sky, tracer fire streaked like lightning, and waves smashed against the landing craft. Men shouted, orders were lost in the roar, and the air smelled of salt and gunpowder. Amid that chaos, the jeeps rolled out, bouncing through surf and sand, their engines coughing salt water but never quitting. They raced ahead of infantry, dragging wounded men to safety, hauling ammo through shellfire, and clearing paths for Sherman tanks stuck in the dunes. The Germans and Italians defending Sicily had never seen anything like it. These small vehicles moved faster than armored cars, slipped through rubble-strewn streets, and seemed impossible to destroy. A captured German sergeant later said, "They were like ants. You crush one, and 10 more appear." In the Sicilian mountains, the terrain turned brutal, narrow roads twisting through cliffs and olive groves. Heavy trucks couldn't climb them, but the Jeep could. Soldiers drove them up impossible slopes, hugging the edge of cliffs, engines growling as tires gripped the rocky paths. At night, they moved without headlights, guided only by moonlight and instinct. One driver recalled, "You couldn't see the road, just a silver thread between shadows. One wrong turn and you were gone." But the Jeep never hesitated. When the Allies finally broke through Sicily and landed in mainland Italy, the roads were worse: mud, rain, and bombed-out bridges. Yet, the little Jeep kept going. It carried generals through minefields, priests through villages, and mail to lonely soldiers in the trenches. It even ferried General George S. Patton himself, who called it a cross between a mechanical mule and a faithful dog. In the Italian campaign, the Jeep became a symbol of endurance. Soldiers gave theirs names like Bouncing Betty, Faithful Sue, and Little Devil. They painted stars, slogans, even girlfriends' names on the hoods. Each Jeep told a story. One mechanic wrote, "You fix her with wire oil and prayer, and she'll take you home again." But war was changing. The Allies were winning ground, and the Jeep's reputation was spreading fast. By 1944, factories in America were running 24 hours a day, producing over 600 Jeeps a day. From Detroit to Toledo, from Ford plants to Willis assembly lines, the rhythm of stamping presses became the heartbeat of the war effort. Women in factory uniforms tightened bolts, checked engines, and stamped the iconic 7-slot grille, the Jeep's face, onto steel bodies. Each vehicle carried a serial number and a silent promise. This machine would not stop until victory was won. Then came the greatest test of all, Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. The morning of June 6, 1944, was gray and cold. The English Channel was choked with ships. Soldiers waited in landing craft, faces pale, hands trembling, staring into the fog. Behind them, on the decks, Jeeps were tied down with rope, ready to roll the moment they hit land. Some soldiers patted their Jeeps like old friends, whispering, "Don't let me down today." When the ramps dropped, hell erupted. Machine guns tore through the surf, shells exploded in the shallows, and the air screamed with chaos. Jeeps leapt into the water, some sinking, some stalling, but others roared forward. Drivers gunned the engines, splashing through waves and fire. Tires clawed through sand and blood, engines whining as they pushed past wreckage. On Omaha Beach, a young driver named Private Charles Hayes guided his Jeep through chaos. His passenger was a medic, the back loaded with stretchers and bandages. Bullets tore the air, but the Jeep didn't stop. It slid behind a steel obstacle, then darted forward again, dragging 2 wounded men toward a medic tent. The engine smoked, the windshield shattered, but the machine kept moving. "I think it was running on courage," Hayes later said. "Mine or its own, I don't know." By noon, Jeeps were everywhere. They hauled ammo, carried officers, towed guns, and turned into mobile command posts. General Omar Bradley's headquarters Jeep, nicknamed Vixen Tor, became famous, seen in countless photos, always surrounded by maps and men making history. The small vehicle had become the very image of American mobility and determination. As the Allies pushed inland, the Jeep adapted again. In the hedgerows of Normandy, it slipped between trees where tanks couldn't fit. In towns like Corentin and St. Lo, it raced ahead of infantry, scouting roads and ferrying supplies. When bridges were destroyed, soldiers laid planks across gaps, and the Jeep crossed first. The Germans had long stopped mocking it. They captured Jeeps whenever they could, repainting them with black crosses and using them for their own reconnaissance. In some ambushes, German troops even disguised their vehicles as American Jeeps to get behind Allied lines. The Wehrmacht began studying its design, realizing the genius of its simplicity. One captured officer told an Allied interrogator, "You can repair it with a hammer and wire, and it still runs." Through France, Belgium, and into the heart of Europe, the Jeep became a constant companion. It carried chaplains to battlefield funerals, nurses to aid stations, and reporters to the front. It hauled artillery shells, water, and even Christmas mail. When winter came and the Battle of the Bulge turned the Ardennes into a frozen nightmare, Jeeps rolled through snow with chains on their tires, headlights covered in tape to hide from enemy bombers. In Bastogne, surrounded and freezing, American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne depended on Jeeps to bring food and medical supplies through enemy fire. One soldier later said, "You could hear them before you saw them, those little engines coming through the dark." That sound meant we weren't alone. The Jeep became more than a vehicle. It became a legend in motion. Every soldier had a story about one, how it carried them through a storm, pulled them out of mud, or saved a buddy's life. Journalists called it the greatest piece of engineering ever made for the common soldier. Even enemy prisoners admired it. "It is the only machine that works always," one German POW told his captors. Meanwhile, back in the US, the Jeep became a symbol of home. Posters showed smiling soldiers behind the wheel, slogans reading, "Keep 'em rolling," and "This little car will get us there." Civilians sent letters asking if they could buy one after the war. The answer, soon enough, would be yes, but that part of the story was still ahead. For now, the Jeep rolled on, through the mud of France, the ruins of Germany, and the shattered bridges of Europe. It carried generals, grunts, nurses, and heroes. It crossed rivers on rafts, was lifted by gliders, and parachuted into battle. It was there at every major Allied victory, engine humming, tires spinning, unstoppable. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, Jeeps led the parade down the Champs-Élysées. Crowds cheered, throwing flowers onto their hoods. French children climbed onto the fenders, soldiers laughed and waved, and the little vehicles, dented, dusty, and worn, rolled proudly as symbols of freedom. By then, the Jeep had earned its nickname in every language: La Jeep in France, Der Jeep in Germany, El Jeep in Spain. It was no longer just an American machine, it belonged to the world. As the Allies marched toward victory, one correspondent summed it up perfectly. In war, there are machines that destroy and machines that endure. The Jeep is the one that endures. The war was not yet over, but the Jeep's reputation was immortal. It had crossed continents, survived deserts, jungles, and snow, and carried humanity through its darkest hours. The little toy had become the backbone of the greatest military campaign in history. And still, it wasn't done. Ahead lay the jungles of Burma, the islands of the Pacific, and the dawn of peace, a new life waiting beyond the battlefield. Because as every soldier soon learned, the Jeep doesn't stop when the road ends. It makes its own road. The European war was nearing its end. The skies over Germany burned with the fire of Allied bombers, and the roads were filled with victory columns, tanks, trucks, and always Jeeps. The little vehicle that once drew laughter was now everywhere, leading convoys through wrecked cities, splashing through rivers, or idling beside bombed-out cathedrals. Soldiers leaned on its fenders, smoked cigarettes, shared rations, or napped across its hood. It had become part of the army's heartbeat, its sound, its smell, its rhythm. But even as the Reich collapsed, another storm still raged thousands of miles away: the Pacific. While Europe celebrated, the Pacific Islands were turning into brutal battlegrounds. The terrain was nothing like North Africa's open deserts or Europe's cold fields. Here, the Jeep faced new enemies: mud, heat, and jungle. Japan's forces had fortified every island, and the Americans needed mobility more than ever. On coral beaches and dense jungles, Jeeps once again rolled off landing craft, engines roaring against crashing waves. They were stripped of doors, their windshields folded down, their bodies covered in mud and palm leaves for camouflage. On Guadalcanal, Marines used Jeeps to haul supplies through knee-deep muck, their tires spinning but never giving up. Mechanics rigged them with wire mesh to keep the engines from drowning. On Bougainville and Tarawa, Jeeps carried wounded men back to the beach under sniper fire. In the Philippines, they pulled artillery through rice paddies, carrying troops, ammo, and radio gear through swamps and shattered villages. The Jeep became an amphibious creature in the Pacific, a land crab that could crawl through anything. Some soldiers fitted them with makeshift propellers and pontoons, creating swimming Jeeps. Others strapped machine guns to the hood, turning them into mobile gun platforms. The soldiers laughed that the Jeep was half dog, half boat, and fully insane, but it kept them alive. In the Burmese jungles, British and Indian forces under General Ord Wingate used Jeeps in one of the most daring operations of the war: the Chindits. Airdropped by gliders deep behind enemy lines, Jeeps were assembled in the jungle and driven straight into combat. They carried wounded men across rivers, climbed muddy ridges, and towed artillery through places no truck could ever reach. One British officer wrote home, "If there's a road to hell, the Jeep would drive it and come back asking for fuel." By 1945, the Jeep was everywhere, from the snow of Norway to the sands of Iwo Jima. It had outlasted every terrain, every battle, every attempt to break it. And as the Allies closed in on Japan, the Jeep became a symbol not just of war, but of victory itself. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Emperor of Japan finally surrendered, the world breathed again. The guns fell silent, the skies cleared, and the roar of tanks faded into memory. But on the streets of Tokyo, Jeeps rolled once more, this time not for battle, but for peace. American troops drove them through ruins, waving to children who smiled for the first time in years. The Jeep had become a messenger of change. Across Europe and Asia, it appeared in liberation parades. In Paris, Rome, Warsaw, and Manila, it carried flags and flowers instead of rifles. Soldiers who had fought for years now used their Jeeps to deliver food, rebuild roads, and reunite families. A French villager said it best: "When you saw the Jeep, you knew the war was over." But peace brought a new question: what to do with the thousands of Jeeps left behind? Some were sold to civilians, others given to farmers, mechanics, and police forces. In every country, they became part of daily life. They plowed fields, carried mail, and transported children to school. A machine born for destruction had become an engine for rebuilding. Back in America, Willis Overland saw the future. In 1945, they took the battle-tested Willis MB and gave it a new name, the Willis CJ, civilian Jeep. It looked almost the same as the war model, but now its purpose was peace. It could farm, haul, and explore. Advertisements showed smiling families driving through pastures, waving from open fields, the same 7-slot grille shining under the sun. The tagline read, "The sun never sets on the Jeep." The transformation was complete. What had started as a desperate wartime experiment became an American icon. The Jeep was no longer just a vehicle. It was freedom on 4 wheels. But even after the war, the military couldn't let it go. The U.S. Army continued to use Jeeps in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. They were updated, modified, but always recognizable. That same spirit, the simple, rugged, go-anywhere attitude, stayed the same. A soldier in Korea once said, "We might lose everything else, but not the Jeep. The Jeep is forever." Even the enemies it once fought came to respect it. After the war, captured German engineers studied the Jeep's design. Ferdinand Porsche reportedly called it a masterpiece of practicality. The Soviet Union built its own copies. In Japan, Toyota's early Land Cruisers borrowed heavily from Jeep engineering. The world had learned something important. Simplicity can be more powerful than sophistication. In the following decades, the Jeep would climb mountains, cross deserts, and appear in movies, farms, and jungles. It became a favorite of explorers, photographers, and adventurers. Presidents rode in them, farmers depended on them, and families took them on their first vacations. But for the soldiers who had driven them through hell, the memory of the Jeep was more than nostalgia. It was survival. They remembered its smell, the way its engine hummed in the night, the feeling of safety it gave when the world was falling apart. One veteran once said at a reunion, standing beside a restored Willis, "I owe this little thing my life. She got me home." In post-war Europe, a strange thing happened. In old barns, forests, and backyards, Jeeps were found decades later, rusted, broken, but still recognizable. Locals restored them, polished their faded green paint, and drove them again in parades. In Normandy, every year, veterans' families still drive Jeeps along the same beaches where the invasion began. The engines sputter, the tires leave marks in the same sand, and history comes alive once more. The Jeep didn't just win battles, it won hearts. It became part of human memory, a reminder that strength doesn't always come from size or armor. Sometimes it comes from persistence. One journalist wrote after the war, "The Jeep did for the soldier what the horse did for the knight. It carried him through the impossible and asked for nothing but gas and grit." By the end of World War II, more than 640,000 Jeeps had been built. They served on every continent, in every climate, under every flag of the Allied world. No other machine had been so small, so simple, yet so mighty. Even today, the Jeep's design remains largely unchanged, its shape instantly recognizable, its purpose eternal. It's still the symbol of endurance, of freedom, of never quitting even when the road disappears. And that is the final irony of the story. The same German generals who once mocked it called it a toy, a silly little box on wheels. But when the war ended, they saw it leading the victory parades, crossing their cities, and carrying peace instead of war. History had its last laugh. Because the Jeep that everyone mocked had done the impossible. It had beaten deserts, jungles, snow, and steel. It had carried the wounded, the weary, and the brave. It had conquered continents, survived chaos, and carried the dream of freedom on its 4 small tires. And in the end, it didn't just help win a war, it helped build a world. They laughed at America's Jeep. The narrator's voice fades, low and reflective. But the laughter died long ago, drowned out by the sound of its engine.